What's up, guys? Doomwake here, and welcome back to another episode of Watching the Meta, the weekly series where we take a look at the MTGO challenge results, sometimes some paper tournaments, if those are available to us, and we see what the heck happened. Take a look and see what the winner's metagame is. Maybe there's some spice along the way. Before we get started on today's video, a quick word from our sponsors, CoolStuffInc.com. Need some singles for that upcoming RCQ? Cool Stuff has got you covered. Be sure to use promo code DOOM at checkout for 5% off of your next order and this really awesome exclusive Doomwake Rhino token. Unfortunately, maybe not going to get so much use out of it nowadays without Crushing Footfalls in Modern, but it is still a really sweet token. Cool Stuff is also now offering full service selling. No sorting required. Take your collection, ship it over to Cool Stuff, no fees, fast payment. Cool Stuff has got you covered. Send us your cards, we'll do the rest. All right, and with all of that out of the way, let us start with Modern, as we always do. So, in the top left-hand side of your screen, you can see that there were 5 challenges this week. One won by Boros Energy, 2 by Death and Taxes, and 2 by Grinding Breach. Now, you might be saying to yourself, I feel like there's more than 5 every week. You're right, there is. Unfortunately, Magic Online was down for about 24 hours from, I think it was Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern to about Saturday at 5 p.m. Eastern is when they brought it back up. And they shut down all of the scheduled events between that time due to just an obscene amount of lag on the client, and it was something on their end they were trying to fix. They fixed it, but in doing so, we have a little bit less challenges than we usually do. So for Modern, we typically have 8, so a little bit of a smaller sample size, so keep that in mind. And with all of that said, here is what Modern looks like. Now, as far as last week is concerned, it was really all about Boros and Dimir. For the most part, it is still mostly about Boros and Dimir. I will say Dimir, quite a bit of an uptick from last week to this week, from 13 to 22, but really, we were trying to figure out what that third deck in terms of the rock, paper, scissors. Well, it appears we found our scissors in the form of some little gears, Grinding Station. And Grinding Breach went from 7% to 16.3%. So it seems like we have a pretty clear rock, paper, scissors in terms of Boros, Dimir, and Breach, and everybody else is really just trying to see how many of those matchups they can make positive, and that's going to be the key to success in the upcoming couple of weeks, especially for people who are preparing for upcoming RCs. So keep that in mind. You need to have a plan against all 3 of those decks. Past those 3, not a ton of movement elsewhere. Storm went down, Temur went down a little bit, slight uptick in Mardu, slight uptick in Belcher. As you can imagine, given that it won 2 challenges, slight uptick in Death and Taxes. But for the most part, other than those 3 big pillars of Modern, the rest is, like I said, everybody just kind of vying and jockeying for position against those 3. So I mentioned the rise of Death and Taxes. We're going to go ahead and start with one of the challenge-winning lists. And here is that challenge-winning list from Cigarettes After Shrek. Excellent username. I believe that is Theo Jung, for those of you who know that name. This was the Friday challenge, and for people who haven't seen this deck, it's sort of similar to what you may be used to if you've seen Death and Taxes in Legacy or, prior iterations of Modern Death and Taxes before. The one thing about this particular version is it's really built around the synergy between Felia and Overlord of the Baelmerk. So, ideally, if you go turn 2 Felia, and then turn 3 you untap, on your 3rd turn you impending an Overlord, you then get the trigger off of it, attack with Felia, flicker the Overlord, and then the Overlord, when it comes back in your end phase, will come back as a creature, not an enchantment or a non-creature. So there's some really good synergy there. Even when you don't have Felia, just Overlord being able to rebuy Solitude, not that bad. You can Solitude, pitch a card, Overlord, rebuy the Solitude, Solitude go again. So even if you don't have an Ephemerate to flicker that Solitude, the Overlord can still let you do it again. You have a Recruiter of the Guard kind of tutor package here, where you can tutor up Aven Interrupter against sweepers or other big spells, Bogart Trawler if you need graveyard hate, Charming Prince for life gain, Emperor of Bones for just the grindy stuff, and you can even reanimate their large creatures, Flickermist to keep flickering and going again, Skyclave Apparition for a kill spell, Sculler, you can even tutor Sculler in your opponent's draw phase to get the card they draw, and then Witch Enchanter for some artifact and enchantment hate. So you have a lot of flexibility in terms of that tutor package with Recruiter of the Guard. So I like that a lot. Again, Overlord rebuying Recruiter just gives you a ton of value. So maybe this deck's here to stay. I'm not entirely sure how it lines up against Mardu. I would have to guess that Cigarettes After Shrek probably played against a lot of Boros/Mardu along the way. And, the combination of Bowmasters plus Flicker, it's got to be okay in that matchup. But yeah, keep an eye out for this one. And speaking of Overlord and Felia, what if we just took those two cards and put them into energy? And that's what we have here. So shout out to Stream, who just barely missed top 8 in 9th place. Now, correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, but I believe, if anybody knows, I believe this initially came from a Japanese tournament. I saw Fire Shoes tweet about it. I think it was the God of Modern tournament they usually hold. I want to say it was in the 50-player range. And Mardu with Overlord of the Baelmerk won that particular tournament. And I think that's kind of what sparked the idea for people to, give it a shot online. But really, I mean, this is just the energy deck, so cards you're used to at this point, a Johnny, Guide of Souls, Ocelot Pride, Flage, and then you just kind of filter in the Overlord and Felia package. Now, what's nice about Overlord, just by itself, is it fills the graveyard for, you guessed it, Flage. And Felia has also some pretty good synergy here. You can flicker a Johnny to get another token. You can flicker creatures to trigger Guide of Souls. You can flicker Fable the Mirrorbreaker. You could even chain to the rocks their permanent, and then Felia to flicker the chain. Like if you hit a token, then you can flicker the chain, then because it exiles the token, nothing comes back when it leaves, and then it comes back and exiles something else for good. So a lot of cool stuff you can do with Felia, even outside of the Overlord stuff, and the fact that Overlord fills the graveyard for Flage, there's probably something here. Next up, we have Splinter Twin, everybody's favorite card that got unbanned that is unfortunately no longer playable. But Kahlua777 is doing the Lord's work over here, just doing their best to try and get it into a top 8. I believe I saw a challenge somewhere posted on Twitter where if Splinter Twin was to win a Modern challenge, there would be a bounty. I think it might have been Twinless Twin that tweeted that out. And, Kahlua did their best. What I like about this is you actually have the Fear of Missing Out. So Fear of Missing Out plus Splinter Twin is an infinite combo, but it requires you to have Delirium. So you need to be playing with Draw Discard to make sure you can set that up. So we're playing with Oracle of Tragedy and Fable of the Mirrorbreaker to kind of help us assemble Delirium so we can get to Fear plus Twin. And then the other cool thing that Fable plus Oracle does, where you are, looting and filling up your graveyard, is it just fills your graveyard for hardcasting and Oculus. So kind of like a plan B there as well. And then you have the Wizard package with Flame of Venor. You have Flare of Denial with Thundertrap Trainer. A lot of good stuff going on here, but unfortunately, I think Splinter Twin is just a little short of where it needs to be. And continuing the trend of unbanned cards, let's take a look at Green Sun Zenith real quick here. So shout out to XL_Snapcaster in 5th place here. Now, Green Sun Zenith has been showing up a decent amount in Primeval Titan strategies and Yawgmoth, but it turns out it's pretty good in just the 4-color mid-range soup Omnath decks. So what's nice about Green Sun Zenith is if you have Omnath and a fetch land, you have an abundance of extra mana. You may not necessarily have something to do with that mana, but if you have a Green Sun Zenith, you can just float all of that mana and go get an Atraxa. Maybe you only have 2 mana for a Green Sun Zenith and you just need a mana dork. Delighted Halfling's got your back. Maybe you have 3 mana and you need some graveyard hate. Keen-Eyed Curator. Or 4 mana and you have Endurance. The list goes on and on in terms of the number of, the things that it gives you access to, in addition to being a top-end threat and a 1-mana accelerant, because you can go get Dryad Arbor, of course. So it feels like there's no spot on the curve where casting Green Sun Zenith is bad in this deck, and that looks phenomenal. I love the way this deck looks. Not a big fan of the Omnath decks myself, but if I were to play one, it would probably look quite a bit like this. And with Modern out of the way, let us transition over to Pioneer. So remember, 5 challenges this week. We usually have 5, so Pioneer numbers are going to be about the same. And the metagame looks about the same. Rakdos Demons and Rakdos Prowess. We have what appears to be mostly a 2-deck format. There's some other stuff interspersed. Niv to Light, Celestia Company, slight uptick, Mono Red Wizards, Mono Green Devotion, but a lot of these numbers are just not really moving. And Rakdos Prowess and Rakdos Demons seem to be increasing week by week. I mean, I guess we went down a little bit on Demons, but up a little bit on Prowess, so overall kind of a wash. Now, I will say, as you can see, the winners of the challenges, there was a challenge that was won by Simic Neoform, as well as Celestia Company, Mono Green Devotion, and 2 Rakdos Prowess. But speaking of that Neoform deck, what does that look like? Well, astute viewer, here is Simic Neoform. Now, you might normally associate Neoform with stuff like Tasigur and Hooting Mandrills, sacrificing a 6-mana creature to go get Atraxa. None of that stuff here. What we are doing is we're sacrificing a 2-drop to go get, you guessed it, a 3-drop. Now, why would we put so much effort into just Neoforming a 3-mana creature? Well, here's the nice thing. So a lot of the 2-mana creatures that you're playing, Augur of Bolas, Falahi Archaeologist, Thundertrap Trainer, Satyr Wayfinder, they all replace themselves. And in the form of specifically Falahi, I think this is kind of the piece that maybe does the most work in this deck, it not only replaces itself, but it also fills your graveyard. So, going back to Abhorrent Oculus, this card is extremely powerful. You don't necessarily need to cheat it into play, but what's nice about the fact that you have Neoform is normally these Oculus decks would be very reliant on the graveyard. You can only cast Oculus if you exile 6 cards, or in the case of Helping Hand, reanimating it. But this kind of gets around that, where if you just have a 2-drop in a Neoform, it doesn't matter if your opponent has Leyline of the Void, you can just put an Oculus into play and still be able to protect it with a plethora of cards, Tyvar Stand and Stubborn Denial, as ways to protect your Oculus for 1 mana, so a full 8 ways to do that. This deck is completely all in on just putting an Oculus into play and telling your opponent no. I kind of like that. And like I said, the fact that you get to dodge and sidestep Graveyard Hate, it's a really cool idea. Essence Flux as well, another sort of protection spell that you can exile the Oculus and then it comes back to the battlefield. So really, really cool list. You know, I haven't been playing a lot of Pioneer, but I might have to give this one a try. So this town ain't big enough, and Storm Chaser's talent are everywhere in Standard. What if we tried them in Pioneer? And that is what Harry13 has decided to do, made top 8 in 6th place here with a slightly different modification, porting the list, the blue-black bounce list from Standard into Pioneer. And you do get a really significant upgrade here in the form of Waste Not. So remember how this deck just can play Hopeless Nightmare and then bounce it over and over again with Fear of Isolation and This Town Ain't Big Enough. Well, what if every single time you were casting Hopeless Nightmare, you made a 2/2, or you added 2 black mana, or you drew a card? And that's kind of what Waste Not is doing here. I mean, if you think about it, if you look at the non-land cards in the deck, the only ones that are not legal in Standard are Waste Not and Thoughtseize. Everything else is Standard. Well, I guess Fatal Push too. Okay, Fatal Push, Thoughtseize, pretty good. You see where I'm coming from, where you're still trying to do the same thing, where you're just playing Talent and Hopeless Nightmare and just bouncing them over and over again. And it seems like when you're doing this with a Waste Not in play, you generate so much value, your opponent loses a bunch of cards, you're up a million cards, and it's pretty easy to convert those into a win after that. I think that the standard versions don't play Liliana, but it does get quite a bit better when you have Waste Not, because even just turn 2 Waste Not, turn 3 Liliana by itself, pretty good. So I like this deck. Again, I've not been playing a lot of Pioneer, but this certainly is giving me a reason to maybe dive back into it. And here we have yet another reason for me to dive back into Pioneer. An 8th place finish, so Master Brewer did top 8 the event here, with Hammer Time. Now, it's interesting because you'll notice there's only 2 copies of Colossus Hammer. So, Pioneer All-Star Thran Power Suit. So this is 2 mana, equip 2, and that equipped creature gets +1/+1 for each aura and equipment attached to it and has ward 2. So you have stuff like Leyline Axe that he puts into play for free, equips for 3, Shadow Spear, and Swiftfoot Boots. These are all one-of cards, however, you can tutor them with Kellen the Fayblooded, so keep that in mind. And then 4 copies of Sheltered by Ghosts. So if you have a Sheltered by Ghosts and a Thran Power Suit on a creature, your creature gets +1/+0, Ward 2, and Lifelink from the Sheltered, and then +2/+2 and an additional Ward 2. So it has +3, +2, I'm good at math, +3/+2, Ward 4. and lifelink. So it really makes it difficult for your opponent to cast their removal spells when you have like the stacking of wards with Sheltered and Threatened Power Suit. And even more of those stack beyond that. They just keep getting additional ward 2s. So, I mean, it's getting to the point, you're going to get to a point where your creature effectively has hexproof. And that's kind of cool. The other really sick thing about the creatures that we're playing is Apostle has protection from black, Fatal Push Be Gone, and Adanto Vanguard you can pay 4 life to give it Indestructible. Again, Fatal Push Be Gone. So, really cool list here from Master Brewer, and man, I keep thinking to myself, maybe it's time to play Pioneer again. And last but not least, quick shout out here to Medvedev, 26th place. This is Indomitable Creativity, but we have a little bit of a twist. Now, not sure how often you're getting Delirium for Demonic Council. I guess you have 4 creatures, 4 enchantments, and then, instant land sorcery. Those are kind of the easy ones to get, so you need 1 Valgavoth or 1 Fable in the graveyard. But it's mostly here, I think, as a way to tutor Valgavoth. Now, you might ask yourself, why would you want to tutor your large creature in your creativity deck? Well, that's because we're also playing with Zombify. So it kind of gives you an additional way to put a large creature into play. We're pairing that with Prismari Command and Stern Lesson, along with Fable the Mirror Breaker as our discard outlets. And yeah, 4 Thoughtseize, 4 Fatal Push, call it a day. Really clean list, basically all 4 ofs, and looks pretty interesting. And last but not least, folks, we are going to take a look at Standard. Now, the Standard metagame has really been all over the place the past couple of weeks. Last week was this huge uptick in Esper Pixie, and this week, even more of an uptick in Esper Pixie. Went from 17 to 20. I want to say the week before it was like 5 to 17, so it's just increasing every single week. Gruul Prowess, 16 to 12. Dimir midrange took a bit of a dip. Golgari midrange, pretty significant uptick in Golgari. Maybe we'll take a look at why. Mono white, roughly the same. Oculus, mono red, a little bit of a downtick. But really, this is kind of just Pixie versus Gruul versus the world. That's what it seems like in terms of at least the online results. Those are certainly the 2 most popular decks. You could include Golgari / Dimir in kind of that mid-range package. Or like if you want to lump mid-range into one category, you could put those together. But yeah, a lot of Pixie. The 3 challenges, funny enough, none of them are won by Pixie, but Azorius Omniscience, Gruul Leyline, and Gruul Prowess. I do want to make sure we separate the Leyline and the Prowess decks because they are, I would say, relatively different. And even within the non-Leyline Gruul decks, there's still a ton of variations going on. Some are playing a little bit bigger, some are playing smaller to the ground. So there's definitely a lot of variations between each of these color combos. But I have 4 decks that we're going to take a look at today. And we are going to start off today with DB_Dykman, Steven Dykman on Twitter and Twitch, I believe. Dykman has decided to take the This Town Ain't Big Enough and Storm Chaser's Talent shell and kind of pair it with more of a controlling shell, as it were, where normally you see like it's a lot of cheap cards like Pixies and Hopeless Nightmare, the card that I, for some reason, couldn't remember the name of, and like a little bit more aggressive with the Fear of Isolations and things like that. There's no Pixies, there's no Fear of Isolations, there's no Nightmares. It's really just about efficient kill spells, so cut down, disfigure, go for the throat, even a couple of cantrips to help smooth out your draws in the form of Opt, and then really utilizing this town specifically really only with nowhere to run Storm Chaser's Talent and Thunder Trap Trainer, which is, a card advantage engine that kind of helps fill out the curve. But yeah, playing the full 8 suite of cantrips, 4 sleight and 4 opt, and really just opting for a more controlling version of this deck. Not sure if that's the best way to go, but it is certainly an interesting take on the archetype. And talk about interesting takes on the archetype. Here we have King Harry in 29th place. This is Esper Pixie. Well, where's the Pixies? So it's Esper Pixieless Pixie, as it were. Where, okay, so what's going on here? This looks like a bit of a mess. The idea is you have a bunch of cheap permanents that replace themselves. So Clay-Fired Bricks goes and gets a land. Gold Pan enters the battlefield, makes a treasure, kind of, helps you accelerate your mana a little bit. Prophetic Prism draws a card. Tithing Blade kills a creature. Wishclaw Talisman, we'll get to that in a second. Thunder Trap Trainer finds a card. Hopeless Nightmare gets a card out of them. Nowhere to Run kills their creature. So you have all of these permanents that just kind of sit on the battlefield, right? And then what you do is you actually cast Temporary Lockdown. The idea is to lock most, if not all, of your permanents underneath it, because I think everything dies to it. And then once you do that, you can then, this town ain't big enough, and or scroll shift to then loop those triggers. And what the cool thing about that is if you have one or multiple nightmares underneath the lockdown, you can actually loop the lockdown in their draw phase to then make them discard and kind of put them in this lockout. And then with stuff like this town ain't big enough, you can, bounce their thing, bounce your own lockdown, get the nightmare back, nightmare, discard their thing. So you're basically just looping temporary lockdown an endless amount of times and killing them with hopeless nightmare triggers. And the cool thing about Wishclaw is the Wishclaw actually goes under the lockdown. So what happens is you can Wishclaw, tutor for lockdown, play the lockdown, the Wishclaw goes underneath it, and then when you flicker the lockdown or bounce the lockdown back to your hand, the Wishclaw comes back under your side. So with the other really cool thing about Wishclaw, it says activate only during your turn, but it doesn't say only sorcery speed. So you are allowed to use the Wishclaw with the lockdown trigger still on the stack. A lot of stuff going on here. Looks really cool. Maybe not necessarily my style, but if you're into if you really just want to lock out your opponent with lockdown, this one is this one's pretty cool. All right, now you might see this deck list and you might be wondering why we are talking about Golgari sort of in the spice section. This is I really wanted to talk about this in the next deck because there's just been so much churn and so many different variations of these archetypes floating around. So Misplaced Ginger, who for those of you who don't know, very very good and popular Twitch streamer, they play a lot of mid-range decks. And they're basically, all in on Golgari and Standard. And they've been spending a lot of time working on this. Now, there's two very, very different, noticeable things about this list that you might notice. First of all, no Glissas. Okay, we've removed the Glissas entirely. We still have Llanowar Elves though. And then second, no demons, no Unholy Annex, Archfiend of the Dross, none of that stuff. So as far as Glissa is concerned, if the most popular deck in Standard is playing 4 copies of Nowhere to Run, you're better off, instead of playing Glissa, playing cards like Preacher of the Schism and Sentinel of the Nameless City, which Ginger has 4 copies of each. So I think that makes a lot of sense. And then as far as Unholy Annex is concerned, Archfiend of the Dross, which is a card that you kind of have to play with Unholy Annex, pretty bad when it gets stunned with stuff like Flood Pit's Drowner or Kaido Bane of Nightmares. And on top of all of that, all these demon cards, not great against bounce spells, which, again, the most popular deck in Standard has 4 This Town Ain't Big Enough, which is not only a bounce spell, it's a bounce spell that draws them a card. So you just can't really make these exchanges against these sort of Pixie, Nowhere to Run, Kaido-style decks, and I think it makes a lot of sense to make a composition of Golgari exactly like this. So I'm not a huge fan of Golgari in Standard in general, even if you're making these kinds of changes, but if you are interested in playing Golgari, I think this is a fantastic place to start. And last but not least, we talked about going bigger with Gruul. Well, this is maybe going a little too big. So Salvato here in 31st place took the Gruul package, and by package I mean Emberheart Challenger, Heartfire Hero, and Manifold Mouse. So that's kind of like this mice package alongside Monstrous Rage. These 4 very powerful cards that all kind of work and synergize together. They took those cards and they decided to add Llanowar Elves and 3-drops, mostly in the form of Sentinel of the Nameless City, and then Tender Wild Guide, which doesn't necessarily count as an expensive card if it'll load here any minute, but it has Offspring, so you can kick this for 4 mana, get 2 bodies, get a little bit of value that way. So you have some reasons to have, Llanowar Elves, since you have 3s and now effective 4s in your deck. But what this does, and I think a really subtle thing about this, is you now have 7 Offspring cards. You could even play 8 if you wanted to play the 4th Wild Guide. And that gives you a lot more things to do with excess mana. So playing Llanowar Elves, playing a higher land count, you even have maps from Sentinel, so if you have extra mana lying around, you can use the maps. Even just accelerating into leveling talent faster, not that bad. And I think I would even maybe go a bit bigger and deeper on this big approach and also play Paw Pet Recruit. I don't think there's any in the sideboard, but that card has been phenomenal in the cage decks for me, and it is effectively a 3-drop, so turn 1 Elf, turn 2 Offspring Pawpatch Recruit, even turn 3 Offspring Tender Wild Guide. You get a lot of like different curves that you can do and ways that you can utilize your mana in different ways. There's definitely a lot of unexplored space in these sort of bigger Gruul style decks. Alrighty, folks, that is going to do it for another episode of Watching the Meta. Thank you all so much for watching. Please let me know what you thought in the comment section down below. I hope you all enjoyed the video. And until next week, adios.